G20 members still in Pittsburgh trying to tackle the lengthy list of challenges facing the world economy. Here now with his outlook on the meetings and maybe some things that have taken even more prominence today. Jim Rickards, Senior Managing Director of Market Intelligence for scientific consulting firm Omnis. Good morning, Jim. You think that the Warsh piece, it's not totally separate from the G20. It may have been intentional that it came out today, but it's more important than anything that these bureaucrats decide?
I think that's exactly right. It's probably as important as everything coming out of G20. And the news of G20 is very important, but it can hardly be a coincidence that a Fed governor publishes an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal on the same day that the G20 is meeting. I mean, both are rare events, and I think his audience is as much the G20 as it is the marketplace as a whole.
This is Kevin Warsh again.
Yeah, Kevin Warsh, right. The Fed governor.
The Fed governor who is saying the Fed's job is only half over today.
Right. What he's saying, he's giving the market a heads up on the following. The Fed has traditional metrics that they would use to decide when to raise interest rates. Capacity utilization, unemployment, a few other things. What he's saying is that don't rely solely on that. In addition to that, we may look at asset prices. And that may be one of the signals to cause us to raise interest rates, which is not traditional. The question, I think it's intriguing to me, is what asset prices. And Joe, I know you said earlier it might be the stock market, it might be an indication that they think the bull market, this bull market has longer to run. My view is that it has to do with gold. What he's doing is sort of preempting the collapse of the dollar. If gold goes to 1,500, that's not because dentists are suddenly busy, filling people's teeth. It has to do with the fact that the dollar is imploding, and so Warsh is saying to G20, we're not going to let that happen. Now, he can't come out and say that because the minute you talk about the Fed governor talks about the collapse of the dollar would start to collapse. So he's doing it by indirection. But when he said asset prices, I read that to mean basically gold, which is a proxy inversely related to the dollar.
Well, in a perfect world, a guy like you, if you're a policymaker, you get run out of town on a rail. If you try to raise interest rates when unemployment is still hitting higher and going above 10%, theoretically, if you tried to do it right now, there would be so much populist anger or questioning of what you were doing. But you're saying right now that, I mean, you said this off camera, they should have started raising rates 6 months ago?
Sure, to defend the dollar. The dollar is the linchpin of national security. I mean, how are we going to conduct a war, or are we robust to catastrophic events in a world of SDRs? I mean, the Fed needs the dollar to go down by about half over the next 14 years. We have $60 trillion of liabilities. So that's TARP, baseline budget, stimulus, Ginnie Mae, Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, Medicare, student loans, FHA. You go through all the contingent liabilities, it comes to about $60 trillion. There's no combination of growth, no feasible combination of growth and taxes that can fund that liability.
We need to pay half?
We need to pay half. We can pay $30 trillion, not 60. So 4% inflation for 17 years cuts the value of the dollar in half. And that's what the Fed does best. If you had a nickel and 3 pennies in your hand, you had 8 cents. That's the value of the dollar relative to 1913 when the Fed was created. So the idea of price stability is nonsense. What they do is inflate the dollar to sort of prop up the banks. So they need to do that, but that's a dynamically unstable process. So if you try, they would love to do it gradually, and that's the plan. But if the market gets ahead of it, if the market sees this playing out, which they probably will, you could have a very rapid collapse of the dollar. That would be you'd see that in gold.
What other tools does the Fed have besides flat out raising rates? Are there ways they can do it behind the scenes to try and put the clamps on it?
Well, they can withdraw some of this liquidity, but what they really want to do is basically displace the dollar with SDRs. And when you mention SDRs, people just yawn and they're like, what are those? It's complicated. But they're already, basically the IMF, this is the unannounced part of G20. The IMF is being sort of anointed as a global central bank. They're now running a balance sheet. They've issued debt for the first time in history. They're issuing SDRs. The last SDRs came out around 1980 or 81, right. 30 billion. Now they're issuing 300 billion. When I say issuing, it's printing money. There's nothing behind these SDRs. So, I mean, this has to do with something called Triffin's dilemma. It came out in 1960. Economist Robert Triffin said, in order to stimulate world trade and the world economy, some hard currency country has to run persistent large deficits. But if you run persistent large deficits, eventually you go broke. And so he pointed out the dilemma in 1960, but didn't have an answer. Now, 50 years later, the U.S. is getting closer to going broke. We've fueled the world economy for the last 50 years. So how do you get out of that? Well, the U.S. can get its own house in order, but that would cause world trade to contract. So what you need is to kick the problem upstairs. So we're going to use SDRs to fuel the global economy, so that way we can take the dollar off in a corner and depreciate the dollar to solve our own debt problem. So that's the unannounced play. But the empowerment...
Does that mean that we're no longer the country that's fueling
Exactly, and that's called the new dilemma to replace Triffin's dilemma, which is we have a solution for Triffin's dilemma, which is SDRs, but we don't have a solution for the national security implications of that, which is how we, if we have to fight a war, if we have a catastrophe, we no longer have this privilege of printing money. We just have another currency like sterling, or maybe worse. And so, so what Warsh is saying is, we're not going to let that happen. He's saying to the other members of G20, look, we sort of have to trash the dollar, but we're going to do it gradually. And if the market gets ahead of us, and you see gold at 1,500 or 2,000, we're going to raise rates a lot, maybe 50 or 75 basis points to defend the dollar. My point about doing it 6 months ago, but politically, absolutely impossible. I agree with that. You would get run out of town on a rail. But it would have gone a long way to strengthening the dollar and helping our economy in the long run.
Well, you just made a heck of a case for buying gold right at 1,000 then, didn't you?
Well, yeah. The problem with gold is, I like gold, and
You like it at 1,000?
Yeah, I recommend to my clients, conservative clients, 10% gold, 90% cash, and that, I think gold's a double, and that can kind of, give you maybe 7-8% a year for a couple of years with a lot of liquidity and a lot of safety, limited downside. The problem is, when you own gold, you're fighting every central bank in the world. Central banks hate gold because it limits their ability to print money. Yeah. But the market is the market. The market will do it at once. And even the central banks are not bigger than the market. So Warsh is trying to preempt an unstable decline of the dollar. What they want, of course, is a stable, steady decline.
You are better than Professor Robert Langdon at code breaking here.
Thank you.
Latest Dan Brooks. We'll come back very soon, Jim. You've got to tell us more
Good.
about it.
Thank you very much.